I'm Pablo, and you are watching the 161 Report. We're streaming to you live from Bamboo Strategic Media. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. The 161 Group has spent the past 3 years putting on the best networking events in Gainesville. Due to COVID-19, we're not able to host in-person networking events, so we're bringing this platform, the 161 Report, to you, bringing you virtual events with guest speakers and a platform to help our local businesses weather the storm. Today, we've got a very special guest lined up, and we're really excited to bring him to you. His name is Mike Cottmeyer. He graduated from UF in 1993, and he's the founder of Leading Agile. Mike quit his job in 2010 to start Leading Agile, a consulting firm. Agile consulting is what they specialize in, and he's built the company from 0 to over 100 employees and up to $40 million in annual revenue in just 9 years. This is a very, very accomplished man, and we're very, very fortunate to be here with him. I believe we are experiencing some technical difficulties, and so we're gonna take this a little break, and we'll be back to you as soon as Mike gets on. And we're very excited to bring this interview to you. Okay, so let's start with the first question, which I believe you started answering, which is tell us about your company, how you got started, and how you grew it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So how we started the company. So if you think about like what I was trying to accomplish at the time is literally I wanted to go out and work for myself, and so I had really modest goals getting out of the gate. It was I wanted to go out and just be an independent consultant. And so really just in effect, I wouldn't recommend this for any entrepreneur, but I basically just went out and, quit my job and just started hustling for work. And I think I quit my job and I had my first, I got like a $7,000 contract or something that I thought would maybe carry me for a month or so. And then, my phones kind of started ringing off the hook. And when as we grew people and we started, building back office stuff and we started hiring, and, we went from about, went from just me to a small handful to about 15 to about 30 to about 35 to 60 to 80 to 120, kind of where we are today. Anything specifically you would like me to kind of like noodle in on there?
Yeah, actually, I would love for you to talk about, so Leading Agile, for those who don't know who are listening right now, they consult some really large organizations, some Fortune 500 companies as well. Could you talk a little bit about the problem that you help these organizations solve, and what are some of the long-term consequences if they don't solve these problems?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? So a lot of companies, what they're struggling to do is that they're struggling to figure out how to put value in the market fast. They're struggling to figure out how to adapt to rapidly changing market needs. They're trying to figure out how to deliver with high quality, to deliver predictably, to make and meet commitments, things like that. And you almost have to go back into the history of software development, because we largely work with software development organizations. And so if you think about the way that software has been built for a lot of years, it tends to be very much like you might think about building a house. We're going to do architectural blueprints. We're going to do designs. We're going to gather the resources and do estimates, and then we're going to build it, and then we're going to validate it, and then we're going to deploy it. And what was happening as the software got bigger and more critical, the time that it would take to get something from ideation into market was starting to be years. And companies were realizing that they needed to adapt faster than that. So there was about 20 years ago, this way of building software called Agile was put out. And it was largely a methodology for small teams that were co-located, that could embed with their customers and could really quickly put things into market. And it worked, right? And it worked really well. And more and more larger companies wanted to be able to take advantage of this, but what they didn't really realize was all of the different things that it took to actually make that happen. And so what ended up, kind of our market opportunity was recognizing why they were struggling to adopt agile methodologies, and then to help them remove those impediments to being able to deliver in a more agile way. And so what our company has really ended up focusing on is business architecture, organizational alignment, governance, strategic investment decisions, technology refactoring, basically getting the organization in an alignment in a way that they can actually operate in a more agile fashion. And so the other side of your question is, what happens if they aren't able to do this? Well, some smaller, more nimble company comes along and starts taking over their market share. And and a lot of companies that we've worked with are dealing with really fast, nimble competitors, and they're having a very hard time keeping up.
Right. So for our listeners tuning in, please ask questions in the comments below. We're going to have a Q&A in the last 20 minutes of this session. And so, Mike, why don't you tell us about why did you create this fully remote organization? Was that your intention from the start? Did it just happen that way?
Well, it's kind of funny, right? So, like a lot of things, I mean, as an entrepreneur, a lot of things happen out of necessity. And it's not going to sound super sexy, but I had worked in a company previous to Leading Agile that was virtual. And so I knew such things existed. But the reality is that Leading Agile, we're 10 years old, and I think it said in your graphic that we hit about $40 million last year. We're going to do a little bit better than that this year if the coronavirus thing doesn't go on indefinitely here. But candidly, really, to answer your question, is this really out of fear? It was like I was stepping out into the unknown, and what I fundamentally knew was that I needed to keep margin high, and that meant keeping price low or keeping costs low. And so initially it was just me working fundamentally out of my house. And then as we grew, like my finance team, like I hired my sister, right? And she was down in Tampa, Florida. So she wasn't in Atlanta. And then I hired my first consultant, and he happened to be in Atlanta, but he was working on client sites most of the time. And then, we were growing organically, and I hired a guy who was in DC, and that ended up being, obviously that was remote. He was working on clients in the DC area. And then we got a client out in California, and so we started just hiring consultants wherever we could find them, and they would travel. And by the time we got to 10 or 13 people, it was like, yeah, this kind of works. Like it wasn't even a matter of do we need office space. It was kind of like, what would we do with it if we had it? Would we expect people to fly in when they were not working on a client site? It got to a point where it just didn't make sense. And then we got to a certain point of critical mass where we were just like, well, why would we ever have office space? There's really nobody to be in that office space. And so it was, honestly, it was less a strategic decision. It was early on, it was kind of a fear-based decision, but then as we grew, it just kind of made sense. And there's just hasn't been a need to be physically co-located given what we do.
Right. That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about how, if the coronavirus is having any impacts on your organization? Can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah. Well, so that's kind of the question of the day right now. So we've had a pretty good 10-year run, and so Leading Agile as a company, we're in a very strong cash position. We have access to lines of credit if we need them. And so near term, we're not worried. What started happening is when schools started closing and things like that, and it got to be kind of a bit of a saying nationally. A lot of our clients, out of an abundance of caution, basically said, "Hey, we're gonna shut down all discretionary travel." And at first, the first week, it was like, well, you guys can fly in. And then like the second week, it was like, okay, well, we're not going to let you guys fly in either, but you can work remote. And that was kind of the status quo for a little bit. And so we're sitting there looking at revenue projections, and really none of our contracts ended, or nobody told us that we had to take time off or anything like that. We have a couple of clients in industries that are disproportionately impacted by the economic slowdown, and so they're starting to take cost-cutting measures, which has impacted us some. So financially, we're still profitable. We're actually still we're just about as profitable as we were before, but we're starting to get pressure to help clients figure out ways and get creative, helping them solve ways, create ways to save cash, I guess is what I'm looking for. And so in a few disproportionately impacted industries, but for right now, at least for the foreseeable future, if this doesn't go on along for a terribly long time, I think it's going to be okay. If it goes on for 3, 4, 5 months, I don't know, right? I don't think anybody knows. It'll be interesting to see what that looks like if that becomes the new normal.
Right.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about how have you been able to, from the start, maintain productivity in your organization, maintain consistency and accountability in an organization where people aren't bumping into each other every day, where there's no office and everybody's working remote?
Yeah, so there's probably 2 flavors of answer to that question. So the first, because if you think about it, there's really 2 halves of Leading Agile. There's what I would call like back office, which is, our finance team, our software development teams, our marketing teams. Trying to think who else is back there. Our talent teams, right? Recruiting teams, things like that. And so, with those, it's like that's a relatively small proportion. I have 120 of us. That's maybe like 25 people total. So those groups are relatively small. I have very strong leadership on those teams. And for the most part, we've just hired really talented, driven people that know how to show up and get things done. When it comes to marketing, the evidence of their work is out there. We have analytics on our website. We have social stats. We have all those different things. You can see the content going out. You can see the content getting created, right? So that's super quantifiable. There's certain things on the finance side that are super quantifiable. In the month happens, and clients get invoiced, and the banking relationships get managed, and things. And so inherently, there's a bit of urgency around those kinds of things. The internal software projects we have, very small team. Their work is just incredibly visible, right? So in a small company, part of it is that there's just nowhere to hide, right? So if you're not doing your job, it's like super painfully obvious. Where it's been a bit of not challenge isn't the right thing, but it's like one of the things that's happened on the consulting side, and this isn't so much about working remote, but it's like, how do you get 100 consultants all operating on the same page and all operating with consistency and making sure that we're delivering the right kinds of value for our customers? So like one of the big conversations we've been having with the market over the course of the week, I've actually done 3 or 4 of these kinds of talks around this thing is one of the things that we just had to do to survive and market was operate in a very agile way. We had to break our work up into small pieces. We had to manage on predictable increments. We had to figure out how to make and meet commitments and be able to measure progress. And so that journey for us to be a well-run, consistent consulting organization was actually driven not from working over distance, but it was driven by needing to be able to ensure consistency of delivery, especially as we were hiring new people that hadn't worked on our model. So we're trying to basically give sufficient guidance to our consultants to be effective while we're trying to make and meet commitments to our clients and demonstrate that they're receiving the value that we can that we promise to deliver. So now we get into a situation where, like, normally, even though we're a remote company, our clients, our consultants were on site with our clients. So the coronavirus shutdown introduced a different dynamic. It was not so much how do you manage a remote company, right? We kind of nailed that over the last 10 years. The question is how do you continue to earn the trust of your clients and demonstrate that you're having the organizational impact that they're paying for when your consultants can't be physically present? That actually created a whole different thing. And what was cool about it is the level of transparency, the level of planning and transparency and collaboration and shared responsibility for outcomes and all the things that we had built in order to be able to deliver value when our consultants were present became absolutely mission critical for when our consultants were remote. And so what our hope, we're only a couple weeks into this. So what our hope is that by having really clear transformation strategies, having a really clear cadence of accountability, having very clear metrics and things that you can point at and say, hey, you guys spent this money and this was the value delivered. We can actually measure the improved organizational performance, right? That is what I think is going to prove to be the secret sauce behind all this. And then you just amplify it with Zoom and, Miro and, Slack and all the different collaboration tools that we have in place. And, the hope is that that's going to, sustain us through this time when our clients can't, or when our consultants can't be physically on site with clients.
Right. You mentioned something very interesting in the beginning about hiring the right people and how important that is. And for those listening right now, Leading Agile has a very extensive and thorough hiring process. Mike, can you talk a little bit about that process and how you developed it?
Yeah, that's actually a fairly cool story, because if you think about the evolution of how we're hiring, and I think it tracks the evolution, at least initially, of how a lot of folks hire. It's like, those very early employees were people that I knew and had worked with and had seen speak and, just had history with. My very first consulting hire was actually a guy that I had worked with in a previous company. And so, their attitudes, their behaviors, how they show up, their commitment, right? All those kinds of things. And then, as we got, really past 15-ish or so, or even some of the early ones, it's like we would have people that we thought were awesome. And they were awesome people, and they were really knowledgeable, but they didn't really work on clients. And so somewhere about, maybe it was about 4 or 5 years in, I hired a lady named Rachel Howard, who's our chief cultural officer. And Rachel, the first thing I asked Rachel to do is I said, look, we need to figure out how to standardize our hiring process. And we need to figure out how to get up underneath people and understand what they're made of before we can, before we hire many more and before we grow. And so we started working with a company called People Best that I think is based in Texas now, but they were based in Southern California at the time. And they have a tool called People DNA. And what we basically did is we basically ran it. It's kind of like I'd say like almost like a Myers-Briggs kind of thing, but like really on steroids. It really breaks people apart on hundreds of different dimensions, and there's different roll-up views and everything. And so our first step at this is we took this tool and we tested all our people, and we said, okay, which ones do we think are great? Which ones do we think are okay? Which ones do we think are maybe even on the bubble? And we started developing patterns for what we thought a good profile was for us. And what's interesting is we're constantly revising those hypotheses as we learn more information. So we went down that path, and then we started looking at things like emotional intelligence and came up with minimal emotional intelligence standards. We started looking at things like intellectual intelligence, IQ tests. There's a really fascinating test that we use called Color Code. I strongly recommend. It's actually been somewhat life-changing for me personally and professionally understanding this, but it looks at people on the spectrum of their emotional or logical, controlling, non-controlling, and basically gives like a pretty rich profile of people. And of all the things we use, that one to me is actually the most predictive of how people are going to show up and perform on an organization. So as we've gotten bigger, And as we've learned more, and as our staff is diversified, and we have more senior people, and we have some more junior people, and people are in different kinds of accounts, we've basically built some very rich profiling data, so we can start to anticipate how people are going to show up and perform when they're on our accounts. And so these people are all over the country, and at most sometimes we might get an opportunity to interview them over Skype. We've started at times for certain candidates, flying them in and actually seeing them face to face. But as you might imagine, that's a very expensive proposition. And so we go through all the profiling. We see we see how they match to other people within our organization. And then we tech interview them. We do skills and experiences and all that kind of stuff. And then sometimes for some people we'll actually do face-to-face interviews as well.
Right. So you mentioned the culture. How important is the culture at Leading Agile, and how are you able to maintain that in a remote setting? There's a lot of businesses right now that have been forced to start working remote, and they're wondering how can they maintain that culture that they've tried to build in person in a remote setting?
Yeah, well, so one of the things is, I mentioned Rachel. Rachel's our chief cultural officer, and so that's largely her responsibility to. Well, okay, it's an interesting thing to say. So she's kind of like point for making sure that we're paying attention to this kind of thing, but it's mine and a lot of people's responsibility for making sure it works. Culture means different things to different people, and so how. I think of culture a little bit more systematically, and I think about who we are as a company and how do we behave as a company. And so that to me is our systems, our practices, how we do incentives, how we run the organization, the values that we espouse, how well we live up to those values. And I would suggest almost in a lot of ways that flows from me because I'm a big systems guy and I'm a big fairness guy, and I want to make sure that all of our systems, so I am on top of that all the time. Rachel, on the other hand, is more on the feeling side, and so she stays really in touch with our people and makes sure that she's in touch with the emotional side of the organization. And so on that side of things, it's things like, we do fantasy football leagues, and we do March Madness stuff, and we do virtual happy hours. And, Rachel flies out and meets with our teams and takes them out to dinner. And some of our account leads will do things like, events and city tours and things like that. Because so it's like to me with culture, everything has to be really super congruent. It's like the systems, the practices, the espoused values, how you make decisions. All of that stuff has to be in alignment with who you want to be, but then people have to feel good about working there too. And so I think depending if you're more of a feelings person or more of a logic person, you might experience the culture or might have different views of what culture should be or what culture is. But regardless is you want all of that stuff to be very congruent within an organization. And then maybe the last thing I'll add is there's a lot to how you communicate. And so one of the things that we really do is we try to make sure that there's multiple channels for engagement within the organization. So we have a every morning all hands meeting, and it's literally we walk through financials, we do team retrospectives, all 120 people are invited, we do leadership readouts, we do account readouts, we do pod and community of practice readouts. And so we have a rich communication infrastructure. We have Slack as a corporate communication tool. We send out monthly newsletters with different comings and goings and different things going on in the company. And so the attention to culture, the attention to making sure that people feel like they work for us, because one of the challenges when you have consultants that travel is that they might be embedded on an account for over a year. It's really easy for them to start to assume the identity of the account rather than the identity of Leading Agile. And it's a big job making sure that people identify with Leading Agile first and foremost before they identify with their account.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike. So we're about to we're going to do one more question with Mike, and then we're going to start taking questions from our audience. So So Mike, you talked a lot about the importance of culture in the organization. Shifting gears a little bit, let's focus on the crisis at hand. So
Yeah.
a lot of very wise, people would argue, wise businessmen, successful businessmen say that there's an opportunity in every crisis. Do you
Yeah.
see any opportunities currently? Are there any opportunities that Leading Agile is currently looking at? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the opportunity is probably multifold. One of the things that I think about as a business owner and an entrepreneur, and like I think I mentioned, we're about 10 years old. Even as recently as 2 to 3 years ago, we were trying to build a resilient company, but building a resilient company is really, really difficult. And resilience is in a lot of things. It's like, is your leadership stable? Do you have enough cash? Do you have the right systems in place? Right? All those kinds of things. And so like one of the things I feel very fortunate that like all came together like almost just in time is we have a fantastic leadership team. We have cash reserves. We have the right banking relationships. We have like everything in place. And so like we could have zero revenue for 4 months and not lay anybody off or not worry about it. We can break even as a company indefinitely and there would be no stress in our system. We can lose money, depending on how much, right? You can lose money for maybe a year or two and still be okay. Now, we might make different decisions if that was happening, but it's nice to be in a situation where the economy can start shutting down around you and you have the ability to kind of look out and go, okay, nobody needs to panic. Let's just hang tight. Let's figure out, let's get some more information and let's make some rational decisions. Right. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Right. And so the importance of resilience in being the kind of company that can withstand an extreme, unexpected global event. I feel very fortunate we became that kind of company in time. Within our company, there are going to be opportunities in this. Like one of the things that's really interesting that we're establishing position papers on and starting to talk about is, we're asking ourselves the question, is remote work going to be the new normal? Right? And so there's going to be implications there for us in terms of like we had to shift our public training offerings to a totally virtual model, right? What's kind of interesting is we went totally virtual and we haven't seen any drop off yet. That's kind of cool. Right? So does that mean that my trainers that go out and do that kind of stuff, that they don't have to travel as much anymore? Maybe, right? It could be kind of interesting to be in a situation where my consultants don't have to travel for full time. There might be some top line revenue impacts or something like that. There might be some interesting things on our back office about how we handle expenses and such. But those are kind of interesting opportunities. Then we start asking ourselves things like, well, do we want to build additional capabilities to reinforce our effectiveness doing distance learning and distance consulting and things like that? And so I think there's opportunities there for us, but I think it's a little too early to decide if we want to invest down those paths. I think we're going to some, but the reality is that in a lot of ways we actually believe that face-to-face interaction is actually more powerful. And so even if you're effectively working at distance now, there's a cost associated with working at distance, right? And so I'm going to be interested to see if companies recognize that cost and want to absorb that cost over time. So from our client's point of view, the ability to adapt and respond to change. You look at companies like, like GM and GE or somebody, I can't remember who was being discussed in the news, that are going to go from making cars to making respirators, right? The ability to pivot production capacity in real time is fundamentally a business agility problem. The ability to rapidly respond to just overnight market market changes. That's a business agility problem, right? And so what I'm hoping that the world recognizes is that the need to be able to respond to dramatic change is it's not going to go away. And so the opportunity for our clients is to recognize the need for business agility, and then to take the steps necessary to make sure that they can respond to change. And if they do that, that's going to create opportunity for us, because we're in the business agility and change management space, right? And so our general disposition as a leadership team is that we're in a strong position as a company. We're going to withstand 3 to 6 months of this if it lasts that long, maybe longer, right, depending upon how big an impact it is. We're going to make adjustments now. And we think the market opportunity for us is going to be even stronger on the backside of this, as companies recognize that they have to be more resilient in the face of this kind of thing, because we're a global world, right? I mean, it's like I read something that was like, we're only as healthy as the least healthy country in the world, right? And so that's going to drive changes in healthcare. It's going to drive changes in how medicines are being produced, how countries communicate, how governments operate. And I personally think we're well positioned to help those organizations make those kinds of changes.
Absolutely. So now we're going to shift gears and go to questions from the audience. And by the way, for everybody tuning in now, you're watching the 161 Report. Thank you to Bamboo Strategic Media for making this possible. We've got Mike Cottmeyer from Leading Agile here on the line. And so moving to our first question from our listeners and our viewers, how does a client know when they need your services, Mike? And how do they go about reaching out to you?
So how do clients know they need our services? So it's really like what we decided. This is kind of a tactical answer, and then I'll kind of branch a little bit more strategic. One of the things that we decided a long time ago is that what we do is very difficult to sell. It's very easy to market, and it's very easy to educate people. And so, like if somebody just called us up out of the blue and said, "Hey, Leading Agile, you sound interesting. What do you do? I want to see if we can, use your services." Or if I had a sales guy show up and say, "Hey, we're Leading Agile. We would like to come and consult for you." I can't convince you that you have a problem that we solve, right? So what we do is we market and educate by doing stuff like this and doing our own webinars and getting out speaking and white papers and position papers and blog posts and social media and just all kinds of different things. What we try to do is we try to educate people about the problems that they have. And so we try to connect to their problems. And, me and my leadership team and our consultants, we have hundreds of cumulative years of working in organizations, and we know the kinds of problems that organizations face. And so we talk about those problems and we connect with those problems. And then we have very credible, well thought out approaches to solving those problems. And when you have the problems that we solve and you hear our approach to solving them, for a lot of people, it makes a ton of sense. And then, so they reach out to me, or they reach out to somebody on our team they know, or they reach out on a contact us form, and we get on the phone and we talk about how we go about engaging to solve those problems. And if there's alignment, right? If they believe they have the problem that we solve, and they believe that we have a credible solution for solving it, and they like our approach to solving the problem, then we're a great fit. And I'm on record, and this is a hard thing as a business owner and a consultant to say, is we are not everybody's consultancy. And we're actually really clear. There is a very specific kind of problem that we solve, and there's a very specific way that we solve it. And so we're not trying to go into every company and be everything to everybody. We're trying to let people know what we do, and the people that have the problems we solve and where our approach resonates, they tend to find us. And so most of our work right now is either inbound, like they come in through our web forms, or they're an introduction from another client, or there's somebody we've met at a conference, or they hear me talk in a forum like this and they decide to pick up the phone and call. We don't have any outbound sales at all. So, again, right? It's like, and it's almost one of those things where if we get a referral from somebody and that company hasn't familiarized themselves with our approach, it's actually a very, very difficult thing for us to sell because we almost count on the fact that by the time you've called us, you've been consuming our material for a long time and we've had the chance to educate you. It's not impossible for us to take a cold call and to convert it, but it's just really low probability at the end of the day because we needed to have educated you for a while before we get on the phone with you.
Yep, and that's a great point, Mike. So for our audience, a little summary: do not market, educate. Educate the market, and they will come to you. So for our listeners,
it is marketing. Well, I'll say it is marketing, but it's very generous marketing. I'm a huge Seth Godin fan, and so Seth Godin's all about permission-based marketing, and so the idea is you put so much value out into the market that people want to be connected with you, and they want to be a part of what you're doing. It's still marketing, but it's not advertising and it's not selling.
Right.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So for our audience, one of the things that we also do at the 161 report is we take questions ahead of time. We're having some difficulty seeing the questions on the screen right now. So we're going to bring up some of the questions that we had submitted to us before the show. So one of those questions, Mike, one of our viewers is wondering, what does a day in your life look like?
Interesting. Well, it's very different right now. So it's interesting. So a little bit of a fact about me is my wife was diagnosed with leukemia about a year ago, and so the last year of my life has been way different than what the previous years were. So there's a pre-diagnosis day in the life of Mike, and there's kind of a post-diagnosis day in the life of Mike. So I'll give you the pre-diagnosis because it's a little closer to the day-to-day reality of a CEO. So I'm usually up by 5 every morning. I have a morning routine for a couple hours that involves exercise and eating something healthy and journaling and meditation. And so, people talk about power hour kinds of things. It's kind of like that. And so I do that for the first couple hours of my morning. On 7 a.m., I do a daily leadership call with my 7 executives. And then at 7:30, we do all hands meetings with the entire company. And so that goes from about 7:30 to about 8:30. And then, after that, right, so my days are largely varied. And they're usually filled with one of 3 classes of things. So I'm usually either traveling to a client site to do some sort of executive meetup, participate in a readout. I might be going to a client site to do or a prospect site to do some sort of sales activity, that kind of a thing. So there's a class of things that would be involved that would be considered like client site stuff, right? Prospect site stuff, traveling for sales, right? That kind of a thing. And then there's another class of things that I do, and sometimes these are not just one or the other. Sometimes they're all blended together. I have one-on-ones with my leadership teams. I have skip-level meetings with their leadership teams. I meet with finance and marketing and my software development teams. I meet with my talent teams, and just kind of get a state of the union and stay plugged in with people. So I stay very connected with folks. A third class of things is, Leading Agile is still largely my company, and I'm still largely the face of the organization. So I do a lot of marketing. So I might be in the studio recording a podcast. I might be on the phone recording a podcast. Sometimes I'm in my office doing, thinking activities, thought leadership kinds of things. And then, maybe I think I said 3, but maybe the 4th class of stuff is what I might call systems stuff. And by systems, it was we got to a certain point in size with my leadership team where we had to really sit down and think about things like equity, stock options. We had to think about compensation strategy. we had to think about executive bonus plans. And you don't want to do that kind of stuff ad hoc. And so you have to sit down and really think about it. I consider myself the architect of kind of our operating model. I take a lot of ownership over how we operate because I think all the culture things that we do flow from that. And so my day is just a mix. It's a mix of sales. It's a mix of marketing. It's a mix of client visits, architecting our operational model, staying in touch with my teams. Since Kimmy got sick, she's actually well now. So she had a bone marrow transplant and is on her way to recovering her health, which is super awesome. But one of the things I started to do then is I really reduced my work hours. And so now what I do, largely the same class of things, but what it's forced me to do is to be a better, a more intentional delegator. And so I get up and I still do my morning routines. I do my leadership calls. I do the all hands call. And then I actually spend the next couple hours exercising. I run, I bike, lift weights, do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And then usually around noon every day, I will, start meetings. Like sometimes I'll have lunch meetings with my team that's local. And then the afternoon is filled with all those other kinds of things. The one big thing that I do less of now than I used to is I do less traveling. And so a lot of the client meetings I'm doing are virtual just because I haven't been able to be on the road as much. And so I tend to have my admin just schedule those things for me between like noon and 5. And then try to make sure that I have my evenings carved out for the family. So I'm in a really good place, right? Because the company, I've built enough systems within the company, and I have enough talented people around me that I can step back a little bit and I can let the company run itself. I probably went for 6 months, Pablo, working maybe 5 to 10 hours a week when we were kind of in the thick of all this. Yeah. And that to me was kind of a testament to the strength of the organization that we've built is, and I think it is the litmus test of a strong organization is when it can run with minimal supervision for an extended period of time. And that's what my team was able to do for me. And that's probably one of the things I'm the most proud of in building this company.
Yeah, that's an incredible accomplishment, Mike.
Yeah.
So we now can see some of the questions that we have from our audience. And so we've got about 10 minutes. So we're going to kind of rapid fire some of these. We've got about 5 or 6 questions. We don't have to get through all of them, but at least 3 of them if possible.
Yeah, sure. Get those as you can.
So the first one is, how do you define productivity? Is it a function of billable time, or is it a function of goals, achievements for every iteration?
Well, so it's interesting, right? So it's a bit of a hybrid of both, right? So if you think about the measure of success of our company, right? And the brutal reality of being an entrepreneur is if you're not profitable, if you're not making money, you don't get to stay in business. And so, like, one of the things I get really clear with my team on is make no mistake, I am passionate about what we do. I'm passionate about the organization we're building. I'm passionate about our culture and how we operate and what we're doing in the community and all those different things. But if we don't do it profitably, you don't get to stay in business, right? You don't get to keep playing. And so early on, it was about utilization, but utilization is really just a proxy for revenue throughput. And so we think in terms of revenue throughput. And so however we achieve that is great. And so we have target revenue numbers for each consultant every month. We have target revenue numbers for the organization. We know what we should be doing financially every month if we're operating in a healthy way. So from that point of view, then that's the ultimate indicator. But the flip side of that is if we're not providing value to our customers, then revenue throughput's not even a conversation that you can even have. And so from a client metrics perspective, we have 2 different kinds of metrics. We have what we call transformation metrics and we have business metrics. And so transformation metrics are things like, are we progressing through the plan at the rate that we expected? Are we achieving the outcomes that we committed to? Are the performance characteristics of the organization improving in the way that we hope that they would improve? And then is the organization receiving the business benefit of those improvements, and are those improvements leading to better business outcomes for the client, right? And so if we can get the client's business outcomes, very tightly coupled to our revenue outcomes, then what we do is we create a win-win situation, because there's no Leading Agile winning if our clients are losing, and there's no clients winning if we're losing, right? And so you have to create a system where both sides of the equation are getting the expected value. Dennis Stevens, my co-founder and Leading Agile, he always talks about the idea of exchange of value. And in order for any company to survive, there has to be an exchange of value that both sides agree is worth it. And so the companies pay us money, and they get the performance improvements that they expect, and everybody wins.
Absolutely. So we're looking for our next question here from our audience. And by the way, for those watching, you are watching the 161 Report, streaming to you live from Bamboo Strategic Media. We've got Mike Cottmeyer on the line. We're in the last 7 minutes of this, so hopefully we can get through 2 more questions. Our next question from the audience is, what does the vetting process look like when hiring? I know you touched on that a little bit, but I guess our audience wants to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, I'm not quite sure what to add, right? So again, it's a combination. It's very difficult to get a job at Leading Agile, and there's a lot of really, really smart, talented, experienced people that we choose not to hire. And so what we're looking for is knowledge and experience. We're looking for a ton of measurable but kind of intangible personality qualities that, range from things like what we call resilience and recovery time, like do you get your feelings hurt and how quickly do you get over it, right? I mean, what level of energy, what level of follow through, what level of attention to detail, just tons of parameters. We talked about, are you logical, emotional, controlling, non-controlling, emotional intelligence, empathy, intellectual intelligence. And so we have a ton of data over the last 10 years of people that have worked for us that have worked out, people that have worked for us that haven't worked out, people that have left on their own that we wish we could have kept, people that are here that are performing great. And so we're constantly revising our talent models to make sure that they are keeping up with the emerging nature of our business. Because you might imagine going from 0 to 40 million in 10 years and 0 to 120 people in 10 years, that feels like a long time, but in a lot of ways, it's kind of the blink of an eye. And there's so much changing. I mean, back when we first started, we were working with a lot of big companies, but we weren't working with big companies in a strategic way. We were working with departments or teams within big companies. Most of the organizations that we're working in now, we might not be working with the whole company, but we're working with like a division leader. Some of our largest companies, we're working at the CTO or CIO of a Fortune 10 company, right? I mean, these are guys that are big players in the industry, and so the nature of the problems that we're solving are becoming increasingly more strategic, and the level of business acumen, ability to communicate, all those different things is changing. And so the hiring hypotheses that we had 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, is different than it is today. So we're not only constantly revising our models, but we're also constantly looking for ways to invest in our people to help them grow along with us. And so it's an ever-moving target, but we're finding that the tools that we're using to adjust that target are actually fairly resilient, and they're helping us make those decisions in a very data-driven, quantifiable way. It's not instinct anymore. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we got a last question here before we have to close the production, but so our audience, one of our audience members is wondering, are other companies seeking out Leading Agile's help on adapting to a remote-only approach? And are you guys doing anything on that front?
Well, so that isn't the focus of the problem we try to solve. Earlier in the talk, I mentioned that, I hate to use this analogy, but we're kind of like a hammer looking for nails. Like, we have a very specific problem we solve, and we have a very specific kind of client that we're looking for. Now, that said, like, my general belief is that most companies could benefit from our services, but they have to recognize that they benefit from our services, right? So they have to really kind of come to us and self-identify with the problem. And so So the idea of remote work is not a thrust of our consulting. So people wouldn't call us up and say, hey, we want to do remote work better. Can we hire you? Well, they would call us up, and this is the conversation that's happening, because we have a bunch of people in our sales pipeline right now that want to work with us, but they're scared to get started during this time of uncertainty, right? They don't know how it's going to work engaging with us remotely. So what we have to do is we have to have a strong point of view in market for how we're going to deliver value, given that our consultants aren't going to be on site, at least not for a time, right? And I think we've got a very strong story to tell. And so to answer the question, we are out in market. We are telling that story. And I think we're telling it in a very compelling way. And I think we have a very strong story to tell. But it's not the story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to our viewers for tuning in. Mike Cottmeyer, thank you so much for being with us today. Even though we had some technical difficulties, we adapted quickly. And
we did.
And there you have it, guys. Leading Agile, Mike Cottmeyer. Thank you very much for tuning in to the 161 Report.
Thanks for having me, Pablo. Appreciate it.